I was putting together one of these Google Slides presentations. You probably noticed I've been doing a bit of those recently. I think they've been going pretty well, keeping me on track and adding a little bit of teeth to my presentations. But I was putting one together on periodization. And I was doing a little bit of research, just trying to remember names so I could put together some historical context as far as timeline, when these ideas came about and how they evolved over time. And I was going to cover the differences between these different schools of thought because periodization has been around for a good amount of time. And in that time, there's been a lot of different brands, a lot of different methods that have come out, and it takes up a lot of attention and time. And as fun as it is to pick those apart, and Lord knows I spend a lot of time doing it, it's also important to know to what extent they're really important and useful for solving problems, and to what extent they're just a byproduct of consumerism. And there was a gap in the market. Somebody saw where they could brand themselves a slightly different way, and that's how they got an edge. And we do spend a lot of time talking about these differences, potentially too much time. I generally think it's a good idea to have more tools in your belt so you can solve problems as they pop up, because as so many videos you've seen have said, results may vary, results are individual. And this stuff gets complex, not really because you have to walk this tightrope and do things just so. It's actually just the opposite. It gets complex because there are so many triggers for growth and so many different ways of getting strong. So that provides a different problem. That's paralysis. That's inability to make a decision, because some decisions might be really vital and others might be entirely arbitrary. So I want to cover this article. In doing this research, I came across an article I had read before. It's been out for a few years, and it really puts in perspective a lot of these issues that exist with the field, specifically what we take from the academic component, and where things kind of get missed when you start to put it into practice. So initially I was just looking into classical linear periodization, which is kind of the OG periodization. It's been around since the 50s. It's associated with Matveyev. He coined it. And we have kind of taken it and repurposed it, because when it was coined, powerlifting wasn't a thing. And it was all part of like a general sports development pursuit. So when we think of like the Soviet, the Eastern experiments and study that were done, it was done for Olympic glory. It was done by the state, which is much different than private entities trying to select for the best talent and find the best methods because they have a financial incentive. This was state-sponsored work being done. And it was really just oriented towards the Olympics. So these philosophies, these ideologies were dedicated towards all sports. Olympic lifting was part of the equation, but in a lot of ways, Olympic lifting wasn't really treated differently than, say, shot putting. And they looked very much in like statistical terms, collecting numbers and crunching data and trying to find patterns, which is a lot different than what we typically do, which is look for physical development kind of in the short term from hard bodybuilding type workouts where we're looking for muscle growth and for short-term changes that we can stack on top of each other. So it's a very different approach. So I came across this article. This is a Greg Nuckols article, Periodization, History, and Theory. And I thought he gave a pretty good insight into the history of some of these ideas and how we probably take a lot of these ideas for granted. We just look at them as being a given. We've been exposed to it for so long. It makes good enough sense. It kind of resembles what we experience. And we lean on it a little bit more maybe than we should. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to react to something, to kind of pick apart something as a means of explaining and trying to clarify some of these points that we spend so much talking about anyways. So Nuckols starts the article out by saying that periodization, it's heavy on theory and lore, but surprisingly light on research. And this is one of the reasons I like guys like him. I am generally a fan of Nuckols, like I'm generally a fan of Israel, because yes, they are guys with science backgrounds, meaning they know how to interpret the data, but they also have a heavy foot in the pond. They're not just kind of tiptoeing in. They're not flirting on the outskirts. They have competed. They have coached people to compete. They are immersed in the practical component. And anybody who is formally educated in how to interpret data and how to kind of critically think about these types of things, they're going to be best informed when they try to take that information and mold it to the real world once they get into the field. And where you find discrepancies, that's where the gaps in the science or the gaps in the data are going to show themselves. So these guys have a very unique perspective, I would say. And there's not as many of these guys as you would think. There really aren't as many of people who are really into the research component, who are also very, very involved in actually competing and training athletes. And this is why I roll my eyes when I see people who are high on credentials but very light on experience, because honestly, I think that doesn't cut it. That's my bias. I really think that you have to have your hands in both. There's not an established enough presence like there are in some sciences, theoretical physics, experimental physics, and there's communication between the two. That doesn't exist in this field. So the people doing the theoretical stuff have to have that practical experience for it to really make any sense and for them to be able to verify their work and see those patterns in the real world. So anyways, that's enough bootlicking Greg Nuckols. He talks about periodization as something that's been made entirely too complicated, which I tend to agree with. And I might even be guilty for perpetuating that complication by trying to kind of sniff out and investigate every little foxhole that I can. There's a reason that very simple programs work and people advocate to keep it simple, stupid. When somebody is new, when somebody's just trying to get a little bit stronger, train recreationally in their free time, do you really need a highly advanced periodized program? Do you need to concern yourself with percentages and deloads and on and on? Or should you just find a very basic cycling program that's been around since the 50s and still works pretty well? So that's a good question. And maybe we'll find out a little bit more about that. He says that it has an accumulation of theory and explanatory baggage. I like that terminology. But the good news is that the good and useful aspects tend to be simple and intuitive. That's also something that I agree with. And anything that I've done to try and investigate these different schools of thought is to try to boil it down and figure out what's important, because so many of the decisions we make in any productive program tend to be fluff. So he gives a bit of history. He talks about how periodization originated in Russia. State-sponsored programs were focused on the Olympics. So following the 1956 Olympic Games, that's how far back we're going. And it was based on two things he says were in vogue. General adaptation syndrome. So we're talking about a phenomenon that was witnessed in a very specific context. They were studying mice and their reaction to lethal doses of drugs. And the other thing that was in vogue in Russia, long-term centralized planning. So Soviet Union was very known for being tightly controlled. The state ran everything, and everything was broken off into bureaucracy, and every individual division had its own jobs, very top-down structure. He mentions the pros and cons of a government operating itself that way. It led to post-World War II expansion was very rapid. Also led to a famine, because when everything's tightly controlled by one singular entity, any lack of flexibility, any lack of play in the joints can be absolutely disastrous when you are faced with a new scenario. And the famine actually led to more deaths than the Holocaust. We don't learn quite as much, or we don't emphasize quite as much of the real sins that were created in other parts of the world by other dictators, which is interesting, because I think most people underestimate absolutely how many deaths came out of Stalinist Russia, like absurd numbers, and Maoist China, absurd numbers directly related to very centralized state control. But it's a very different discussion to have. So long story short is that they did this because they were trying to have a white knuckle death grip on training, and they wanted to have this predictable outcome. I'm sure they also wanted the method. They wanted to know that they had such control and displayed such mastery of their systems that they could predictably go in and just trounce everybody else. And that's what the Cold War was. That's what all of these, like the space race, it was all about demonstrating on the world stage mastery. And that's very much what this was. So he talks about it as a deeply embedded cultural assumption that such endeavors were inherently superior. And that makes sense. we have our shortcomings, definitely, but the fact of a free market that is flexible, where people have to be adaptable and move around as the environment changes, it very much has its pros. And one of them is how industry can kind of pick up the slack and fill in holes as demand changes. And that's a very unique feature of having a free market that isn't nailed down by a state that controls everything. So that's something to consider when you're considering your personal politics. Pros and cons across the board, though. One lean is going to displace some group of people or have some trade-off. So to pretend like there's a perfect organization is very disingenuous. Now, the interesting thing, and he talks about this as part of the lore, is a lot of people associated Soviet dominance with those methods. And I'm sure the investigation, the time and resources were a big part of that. It's like if a parent reads a parenting book, do they become a better parent? Or is it because they're the type of person to read a parenting book, they're going to be a good parent? And I see this as kind of the same paradigm. The fact that they were dedicated to being excellent, it's a big factor in why they were excellent. It wasn't necessarily this one thing that was the linchpin that determined all of this, all of their results in sports. And drugs, and here's the thing, drugs and differences in innate talent make a much larger difference in performance than choosing one training program over another. That is something that very few people know, and that many people are actually very resistant to. That's not a belief, that's not an ideology, that's a fact. Recruiting in sports, exponentially more important than training programs. If it was the other way around, then you should be able, in theory, to recruit anybody. And if you were that dialed in, that good with your training methodologies, you'd be able to make it up in the difference, and you'd be able to come out on top predictably. That is absolutely not the case, not in any sport, certainly not in lifting. And we see that because there are so many different ways to train. If there was such a grasp you could have on your training, if there was such a consistent approach that stood above all others, we would see that in the top 100 list, but we don't. And we didn't really see it in Olympic lifting. A lot of different schools of thought that went into developing the world's best weightlifters. We don't see it in sports, for as much as strength and conditioning coaches like to really fuck with their programs and try new trendy bullshit. The reason they can try new trendy bullshit is because there isn't a high cost to being wrong. It's very important to know that when you have the best responders, the people who have already been filtered through Pee-wee into middle school into high school sports and have demonstrated excellence at an early age, when you can select the best, you have people that are going to respond to just about anything you do within reason. Your main job is going to be just to not get them injured. So you can experiment. You can put in different shit. You can have a good response and go tell everybody, well, this is the way I found it. And that's why we see a lot of gimmicky bullshit, because the cost of being wrong is very low. Recruiting is important. And in the context of the Olympics, drug enhancement is very important. So if you take talented lifters, give them a lot of drugs, and if they work really hard, especially if you have a lot of them, if you have a lot of them that are disposable, you can turn out Olympians no problem. So he kind of proves the point here, where he shows this neat little graph with bronze, gold, silver medals, and he shows the Soviet medal hauls before and after periodization. And they're not really different. They had in 1956, 24% of all of the available gold medals and 20% of the total medals. When you look at 1960 and 1964, so this is after they started to implement these methodologies, 25%, it's a whopping 0.9% increase on the total gold medals. And they actually had a slight drop, 20.9 to 20% of the total medals. So the fact is they were interested from the get-go in being great. The implementation of periodization wasn't really the main difference maker. So Nuckols gets into general adaptation syndrome. And this is something that I reference a lot of people reference a lot. And the reason they do, and Nuckols talks about this, is that it looks exactly like what we experience when we go through training sessions. Now, he has some good bones to pick here, and they're certainly worth considering. The main one being that the scientific study that led to the general adaptation curve that we know, and that's where you start at baseline, you experience a stress, you dip, and then you come back up as you adapt into supercompensation. Or if you continue to experience the stress, you just die. You don't have time to adapt. So this was done with rats or with rodents, and they were applying drugs. And it was mainly looking at the way the immune system and endocrine system of mice coped with lethal or near lethal doses of various stressors, drugs, temperatures, forced exercise, etc. So these were acute responses because they were looking short term. And Nuckols routinely says that there wasn't a long-term component, which is what we look to, because we're doing these 12-week, 20-week, 4-year-long quadrennial cycles. We're looking to stacking long-term adaptation. So the types of implementations that you're going to have to make from day to day, week to week, very different than 3 years in, 10 years in. And this can't really answer that in any meaningful way. And I think it's a valid point, and it's something we don't really think about. But what they found is that when mice were given a fraction of the lethal dose of a drug, it would take longer exposure to a lethal dose to kill them. So they'd have to be exposed to more or a larger dose. And when they were given a non-lethal dose of a single drug, it would take a smaller dose of a second drug to kill them. So what they took from that is that there was like some limited well of adaptive ability that you were pulling from, a finite amount of adaptive energy. And that would explain why you wouldn't need so much of this other drug to kill them if they were already being exposed to this non-lethal dose of this other drug, which makes a kind of general sense. And that led to this idea that you can't train so many things all at once. There's this idea of interference. If you're training contradictory things, or if you're training too many qualities at once, you have this limited pool of adaptation. It would be better to train one thing or few things, get as much as you can out of that, and then try to stack that forward into subsequent cycles. So he goes on to say that these curves that we look at with what happens during our training cycles, it looks a lot like gas. It follows the same pattern. And there might be some carryover, but we're making a lot of assumptions. And because it only looked at acute responses, not long-term, it's not a fantastic explanatory model. So, here's the similarities. You get the alarm stage, which is the dip in performance. Everything gets shut down. It's lower. That might be if you're subjected to poison, an immediate drop in everything. Your body starts to shut down. Or after really hard training stress, you're in that alarm stage. It's hard to operate. You're certainly not as strong as you were at the start. But then the resistance stage, that's your body bouncing back until eventually, if the stress keeps up, you lead to exhaustion. So the same thing happens with the way that we experience the same stress over and over and over. You may adapt short term to a very frequent level of stress, but if the stress is very high and it keeps up, there might eventually be a point of burnout, that exhaustion phase, where instead of stacking these cycles on top of each other where you are continuously getting better, it's just boom, 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 boom. And then whatever adaptations you make are overtaken by the total stress and lack of recovery. And then you exhaust. So these are the underpinnings he talks about for periodization. The idea that a training stimulus has to be big enough to push you into resistance. That's the adaptation stage. That there's a finite amount of adaptive energy, and that training load can be progressed over time because the adaptation of the prior stressor allows you to tolerate a greater load. So each of these implications of what he says a bastardized and massively extrapolated understanding of gas has merit, but because gas falls short as a sufficient rationale for uncritical acceptance. And I'm inclined to agree. I am inclined to agree. As, again, a guy that is heavily involved in the academic component, this is what he should be doing. He should be critical. He should be analytical and skeptical of the things that we generally take for granted as being primary to how we put together these programs. And I actually like seeing things like this. He's taking a second look at and pushing people to do more work, more investigation into something that possibly people have been a little lazy on. And we can think of other scenarios in the training world where that's the case. The simple reliance on Soviet data is a big one. The fact that people still lean on Soviet data from the 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, in order to inform us on how to do powerlifting today, when those studies were derived every bit as much from complex sports as they were for Olympic lifting, and they weren't derived from powerlifting whatsoever. I mean, that ignores the fundamental differences between the two sports. Maximal strength versus explosive strength, highly technical, no eccentric versus slight, or I would say substantially less technical. A lot of eccentric, more wear, more time under tension. They're different movements. So that's a perfect example of a point where we have really just kind of shut up and accepted this as being a good starting point or a good point of reference for how we should train. And it absolutely needs more questioning. It needs reproducibility. Well, you can't reproduce it. It never got done in the first place. Do those same studies, derive that same data, but do it with actual powerlifters. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to do that with technology and social media. I mean, you can decentralize things like this. I'm sure you could have a ton of people potentially sign up for some type of live poll, or maybe they partake in a study. You could get tens of thousands of people, I'm sure, input their work on a daily basis, stratify them by age, gender, weight, what their training approach is. You could control for effort. You could have them put in all of that, and it would be the actual population you're looking for and not dirtbag college kids. So there really is no good reason why we do settle for the explanations we have. It could potentially be done better. And I think if you take the science seriously, it absolutely should be done better. So he says something regarding the exhaustion phase, that burnout and overtraining can be a byproduct of training too hard too often, right? You get past the resistance phase, you grow, you adapt, now you're better off. But if you keep going, exhaustion sets in, diminished returns, burnout. The thing is, though, it may lead to burnout, but the opposite scenario is equally likely. As you adapt to a given load, the current stressor slowly becomes insufficient rather than excessive. This is something I point to a lot when we get into the injury debate, because there's this idea that the body adapts. And I think Nuckols is right. I agree that the same stressor, I just think about it in opposite terms. The same stressor that can lead you to adapt can very easily be the same stressor that breaks you, that leads to issues, where something gets exposed, some problem, some weak link in the chain starts to take a beating and it sidelines everything. So when you're looking at injury prevention and you think, well, if you want to get better at squatting or deadlifting, you do that, your body adapts, you'll be more insulated to future injury. That's true until it's not true. And when you're looking at certain subsets of the population, for instance, if you can filter out people that have been around for, let's say, 10 years or more, training consistently with very little time off, people that are more competitively oriented, people that are in the middle ranks, say really focused on chipping away, getting up to the upper echelon of training. Once you start to look at those groups, you will see more overuse issues. You will see more tendinopathy, more knee and hip issues, more likelihood of back issues, things that maybe settled in that weren't that bad, but instead of dealing with them appropriately, they just tried to train and overcome, and they turned into chronic problems. So that dynamic, that little equation where on either side you have adapt and overcome versus overtrain and exhaust and eventually die, it is unclear based on the individual which side you're going to go to long term and how substantial it's going to be on either side. So the main story is, I think the key takeaway is adaptation is unreliable. It's something we can't predict cleanly. So we can't really speak in these general terms about what type of adaptation you can expect. And it's one of the reasons I think that pop culture with training has taken such a broad approach with trying to implement preventative measures by saying things like, hey, it's a good idea to deload every few weeks. Do you absolutely have to? Maybe not. But if you do, those people that are prone to these issues, and you don't know that you're prone to these issues until you get them, they're probably going to have an easier time. And hey, you guys that aren't prone to these issues, it's still good to clear out psychologically. You're not really doing any harm. Now, with this idea that there's this kind of well of adaptive energy and that training multiple things kind of pulls from it, he says falls apart upon closer scrutiny. Now, he points repeatedly to the difference between like local acute stressors and responses, which is what these gas studies were focused on, and long-term, more generalized studies. Now, he says it's true that training multiple physical characteristics simultaneously may decrease rates of adaptation and increase your risk of overtraining. And this is this interference effect, this idea that you only have so much of this well of adaptive energy, and that trying to spread yourself thin by training too many things at once might be a problem. You might backslide. But he claims it falls apart. And he references strength training and plyometric training added to aerobic training being proved to enhance endurance performance. So there are scenarios where training multiple things at once is actually a net benefit. And it's not as easily explained with this very overgeneralized perspective. And we can also think about popular concurrent training programs that have you train in multiple thresholds, multiple different lifts. So if anything, it starts to create a little bit of doubt that you absolutely have to compartmentalize every part of your training. I tend to think that there's trade-offs, and you should lean towards which one is going to give you the least possible risk. So one of the reasons I lean away from concurrent styles of training is because I think they're more complex. I do think higher frequency, especially if it's present with high effort workouts, more likely to get overuse issues. And every time, is that the case? Absolutely not. But again, you don't know until it happens, and then you're left just reeling like, holy hell, what do I do? Where a longer, more kind of linear approach, it gives you a bit more control with those scenarios. It's easier to run because you're only focused on one thing at a time. The pattern is more apparent. You're not juggling different thresholds. So that's my main advocacy for it. It's not that one doesn't work or can't work. It's just potential risk and pitfalls. So the main conclusion is that gas on the surface seems to bear a degree of resemblance to what happens in training, but that there are some questions brought up based on where we derive that from. Again, we call it a general thing that happens when we know that it's very specific adaptations that cause these responses. Now, this all starts to get teeth when you start to consider how different powerlifting is from other sports. And this is something I've pointed out in the past repeatedly. And people don't like it. People don't like to hear this. Everybody in strength sports likes to think that they're every bit as much of an athlete as pro hockey players and Olympians and NFL athletes. So if you suggest that powerlifting is more simple, it's not as technical. So, well, squatting's very technical. It took me years to master my little foot twist that I do before I set up in my squat. The ritual I do where I take a breath and throw my hands up and look at the judge and look at the ground and swivel my feet around and wiggle my hips and jiggle my shoulders in the bar. It's extremely technical. We're looking at movements that are pretty straightforward. You're under tension the entire time. So proper execution doesn't hinge on this all or nothing approach that you have to get right instantaneously every time, like it does with, say, a snatch or a clean. And there is a lot more wiggle room because people are anatomically different. So people have to kind of find what works for them anyways. As far as a squat, we're designed to squat. It's how the body moves. It's a basic movement. It would be like competitive walking upstairs. Like, it's something that we do pretty well. It's technical in the way that there might be a better way to do it. But I always say it's technical, like making an omelet is technical. Everybody can figure it out in pretty short order. So that really separates it from other sports that have a much higher barrier to entry when it comes to skill acquisition. So these few assumptions of periodization models, it's that it's to perform well, that's your goal, is to perform well. It's to bring about these specific adaptations. It's understanding that different attributes can cause interference potentially, and that it takes less training volume to maintain a particular adaptation, and that these adaptations can potentially build upon each other. So those are kind of the basic assumptions of periodization that he lays out. So when he talks about sports and the complexity, we're using that as a tool to try to figure out how to arrange training in sports that require many, many different skills trained all at once or developed all at once. They need to come together on game day. And many of them work in the opposite direction. They're not, they don't complement each other very well. So he uses football. It's probably the best example, but you can apply this to any Olympic sport, track and field event, any other team sport. aerobic and anaerobic conditioning. You need a basic amount of muscle mass. You need to be able to produce force in the form of strength and explosiveness and power and velocity. You need to master the specific skills of the game, and you need to know strategy. So in something like football, you need to have a game plan memorized. You need to be on the same page with your teammates. That in and of itself is a skill. So the question is, how do you arrange all of this in a way where you can optimize each one without anyone pulling away from the others? And that's where a methodology like this makes sense. I've repeated over and over, one of the big things you need to know about periodization and why it works, or why it should work, is the fact that more varied work comes further away from game day, and you get more specific as you get closer to game day. That is a universal principle. Now, powerlifting, on the other hand, you ready to get mad? Requires 4 basic things, and they're not all as equally as important. You need to be proficient in 3 relatively simple exercises, and yes, they are relatively simple. You need enough muscle mass to produce enough force to do well and hit your numbers. You need to be fresh on meet day, which is pretty easy to do, and you need to have an okay body composition so you're not forced into a higher weight class. And really the first 2 are the big ones. I mean, being fresh, if you get stronger over a 5-year period, even if you're not fresh on meet day, you're still going to do better than when you started. The big long-term sweeping adaptations, that's simple exercises and building enough mass. That's really the big component of getting better. So it begs the question, how do you build proficiency? Well, you squat, bench, and deadlift. How do you build muscle mass? Well, you squat, bench, and deadlift. So he puts a nice pin in this idea by saying, simply put, powerlifting is an exceptionally simple sport. And I would agree with that 100% compared to other sports. That means that you just have to be more dialed in to the few things that are relevant. So it's not that that stuff isn't important. It's just that there are fewer things to juggle. That's just a fact. So the wrap up of this article is to kind of push back against the adoption of periodization as this method that led to superior results in the Soviet Union, and that it shows the superiority of this top-down long-term planning. That's not really obvious. It's pushing back against the idea that gas is really the strong basis for periodized training, and that we can just kind of call that good and put a pin in that. I agree with him. I don't think that's the case. We should be skeptical of our models and constantly look for better ways of explaining these things. And the big one is that periodization theory proposes ways to organize training for varied and often contradictory physiological adaptations, which powerlifting doesn't really require the same amount of attention to. So in that way, as vital as periodization might have been for coming up with better ways to run bigger sporting programs so that you can juggle more things at once, and I do believe that it was extraordinarily important for that, particularly with complex team sports, maybe more so than track and field sports and things like that. But with sports like powerlifting that are very straightforward, the thing that you have to build skill in is also your primary developmental exercise. It doesn't get a lot easier than that. So as your skill gets better, you're going to get more out of it as a developmental exercise and vice versa. So it's almost like a positive feedback loop. So everything that I've talked about and everything I've written that has to do with periodization is to understand that there are different ways of organizing your training, whether you're doing high frequency or low frequency, whether it's very specific or you like a lot of variation in your training, whether you do the same lift 5 days a week or whether you do it once every other week. There are a lot of ways of arranging training. They all tend to work, and they all have their own kind of rule set for what you can likely get away with and what changes you should make if you find that something isn't working the way you thought it would. But there is a reason that if you scroll down the top 100 lists, there are a myriad of different training protocols. And no matter how much one pretends to be the best, it's not obvious given the best responders. It's not obvious given what most novices and intermediates do with success. So there's a lot more to it than that. The big things are making sure that you don't cause harm. Make sure that you don't overtrain. And that's where addressing recovery comes in. And I think that's one of the really important points of periodization, more so than this very tight direction of training that we come up with is somehow the best way to peak for a particular event. I think the recovery aspect of not working in the same threshold indefinitely is understated. And I think the psychological aspect of having this direction is probably understated. So I believe that all of this is relevant and necessary and it works, but maybe not entirely for all the reasons we think so or we like to repeat. And it's maybe not as critically important as long as you're doing a amount of work that's sustainable and you are allowing for recovery and you know which changes to make once stagnation starts to set in. And I think that really is the long and short of it. So remembering that, I am actually going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into these different types of periodization, but I'm going to do it in a way that keeps that in mind, that doesn't try to oversell any one of them as being better than the other, more vital than the other, because that really isn't the case. They all can potentially provide a different solution for a potential problem. So this was a very interesting article. I had read this article, God, it came out, I think 5 years ago or so, and I come back to it every now and then. So yeah, it's another reason why I generally am a fan of Nuckols and the things he puts out. I am probably going to do some more article reviews of his because it's a lot to think about, and I think he does a pretty good job of building understanding by combining what we know from the academic component and what we know from the century of practice that we have in this discipline that has grown consistently and had a network of best practices that it's built over the entire world for decades. So I really recommend his site, Stronger by Science. He's got a lot of good things to read. For a year, I've been working on reviewing his program, the program formerly known as Average to Savage. I've had requests for that for a while, and Greg was nice enough to give me access to it. So I have the program. I just haven't put the review together, but you can look forward to another program review. Haven't done one of those in a while, and that'll be coming up here shortly. Thank you so much, guys. One more reminder, support me on Patreon and through the YouTube's membership page. That's how you get access to me, and that's where I take a lot of my questions and ideas for content from. So if you want closer access to me or if you want to support me, that's the way to do it. Appreciate everybody there. Check out the Base Strength forum on Facebook, absolutely free, and consider signing up for a personalized 12-week program or a full 12 weeks of one-on-one mentorship. Both of those are available on my site. They will be probably for another 2 or 3 weeks before I stop taking clients. Thanks so much for your support and attention, guys. I really appreciate it. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.